Now we're going to learn today's Tanya, right? It says ki. The Alter Rebbe is now going to argue against even referring to the Eibush as Huaydei and Eidu and Huamada. How in effect Yedei and Eidu and Huamada is also an insult to the Eibush. And there's a mazbeh. Ki hamaylo madrega rishenes on Nevraim, the highest level and step, as far as we are concerned, is Chochma. Shalachei nikras reishis, which is why wisdom is called the first. Ki b'yemes, because the truth be told, he reishis l'moked, it is the first and the root of kol ha'chayis b'nevraim, all the life and the vitality amongst the creation. Ki me'al Chochma nimshach, is that only from Chochma is then brought down Bina v'das, understanding and knowledge. And of course, from Bina and Das, u'mehem nimshach, from Bina and Das comes kol ha'midas shebenefesh, all the emotional attributes in the soul, hamaskel, of the intellectual, kein avo, v'chesed, v'racham, love, kindness, compassion, creator, and so forth. It all comes from the mind. So it begins with Bina and Das, and Bina and Das begins with Chochma. Therefore, Chochma is called Reishis. To say this in Balabatisha terms, you would say very pashut. How would a people who don't have a Torah know anything? If you don't have a Torah, how do you know anything? The answer is, you look at the world. The world teaches you. No, if the world does not have something in it, you can't find it there. If there's a quality, there's an attribute that's not represented in the world, as far as you're concerned, it doesn't exist. And some philosophers would say, if it doesn't exist in our world, then it's false, because if it would be true, if it would be possible, it would be actual. As I state in also in Aristotle, right? I never read Aristotle, but they state in Rambam Bishmoi, right? That's how it works. So therefore, when we look at the Eibishter through the prism of the world, higher than Chacham we cannot know. Now, but then we say, Hu ha-Chacham, Hu ha-Ischachmus, Hu ha-Chacham, Hu ha-Ischachmus, right? We make it Achtus. And Chochmah is the source of everything, and he continues to explain how and why he said that Chochmah is the source of everything. We see vividly, Sha'akotten, that an immature person who is underdeveloped Chochmah, and then therefore underdeveloped Bina and Das, She'ein bei Das, doesn't have the intelligence and the depth and the integrity to be able to truly get into something and develop deeper and finer and more complex connections to things. Hu bekas taved achzari. He's always angry and vengeful. Because he's petty, he's impatient. He's polar, as they say in psychology today. He also loves trivial things, which is not deserving of love. Doesn't have the sufficient depth to love such things that deserve to be loved. Why? Because people desire and love things based on how mature and developed they are. Correct? And if a person is intellectually deficient, the person is intellectually weak, they're going to be emotionally deficient. And if a person is intellectually deficient, and therefore emotionally deficient, their lives are going to be simple. And from these midas in the nefesh, is nimshach, but brings down into the nefesh, the letters and the words and letters of the soul contemplates something that it loves. How to affect in practice. Compassion, kindness and compassion. Same with all other attributes. Anytime you plan how to do something practically, which is called machshava, in the world, there's some measure of emotion. What pushes you to think about being kind and charitous? You have a heart. So when you're thinking practically, the thinking practical about how to fix the world is rooted in your emotions. And there's a little bit of an emotion in the practice. Well, midazu and this amida, is the life of this thought. In other words, the emotions generate the practical thought process. And the Nach is a mamshich, 7 lines in the bottom. And after you think about it, of course, and I want you to know like this, and in Chassidus find machshava and hirhur. And it's very difficult to know what's what. There's machshava, there's hirhur, there's also higoyin, hegin libi. But it seems that perhaps machshava, the difference between machshava and hirhur is machshava means to think practically. Hirhur means to think theoretically. That's why machshava is considered an avera, and hirhur is considered not an avera. Hirhur avera is kosher avera. Because when an idea pops into your head, you cannot help it. When you think about it practically, at that point, that becomes an avera. They state befedish and Tanya sof pedikid base. That when you think about it practically, that's the avera because you're being because you're thinking deliberately. But machshava means thinking practically, and of course, when you think practically, you have to be emotional and practical at the same time. And from this thought, then you bring it down to the level of speech to talk about it. And the thought is the vitality of the speech, and the emotions are the vitality of the thought, and the brain is the vitality of the heart as well. And after you speak about it, you do it. Such as Hatzdaka v'chesed, charity and kindness. For example, a king who instructs his servants to give, right? So they're carrying out practically what the king is motivating. Similarly, when you do an act of tzedakah, it's the emotions in your heart which generated the thought that then generated this speech, which is translating into action. Even when you're doing it yourself. In other words, you're not passing it along to somebody else, but you're doing it yourself. The vitality of the soul and its life, which is invested in this action, the emotions, mamish, is totally incomparably insignificant. When compared to the powers of the soul itself, in its life, which goes down into the speech of a person. In other words, of course, when you do something, you do it because you're emotional. But when you speak something, you speak because you're emotional. And the emotions of speech is much greater than the emotions of action. Because action doesn't lend itself to too much emotion. If you're too emotional, you cannot act. You can afford to be more emotional when you speak, but even that has to be limited. Because if you're too emotional when you speak, it comes out of what they call gibberish or jabberish. Gibberish means you're jabbing yourself, and jabberish means you're jabbering somebody else. As is the difference between the body and the soul, is the difference between dibur and ma'aseh, the emotions in dibur and ma'aseh. Similarly, the measure of emotion in speech versus the emotion in thought is insignificantly greater. And moreover, the measure of emotions invested in thought, to the essence of the emotion which is invested in the thought and gives it life. In other words, the higher you go, the more deep, the more of you is invested. You have to have feelings in what you do, otherwise you won't do them. But there's much more feelings in what you say, there's much more feelings still in what you think, and there's much more feelings still in the thought, the emotions itself. V'chein, to continue, similarly, erech, the measure of mahus v'chayis hamida, the essence and the vitality of an emotion. Legabe ha'chochma bina v'das. Notice he doesn't use the word mida again. You see the consistency? By emotions he says the word mida over and over again. By chochma bina das, he simply says chochma das. You see it, right? That the amount of intensity in your brain, in your chacham bin adas, that in general this is the mind and intelligence of a person, which is the source of this emotion. And the amount of depth and integrity in the brain is far greater than the amount of integrity and depth that there is in your emotions. So you see that there's different levels. But the highest is chachma. There's more of you in chachma. There's less of you in bin and das. There's even less of you in your midas. There's even less of you in your machshava. There's even less of you in your diba, and even less of you in your ma'aseh. This is how it is in the souls of people. The souls of all other creations. And all of the worlds, the higher worlds which goes on Atilas and Ein Sof, and the lower worlds which goes on Bria and down. That in all of them, Chochma is the first and the root of all living things. So Chochma becomes very central. Chochma becomes very, very important, because Chochma is the basis for everything that exists. So Chochma is very, very, very important. And what do we say about Chochma? Hu ha-Chochma? Hu ha-Chochma? Hu ha-Chachma? Hashem is one with his Chochma. And Hashem being one with his Chochma doesn't mean he's one with his ideas. He's one with us, because we are those ideas. But the etzem inya that you're saying that there's chachma, which is one, is chiyuv. It's a description. It's atzilas, and we agree with Rambam in atzilas. Achleila ma'ila me atzilas. It's achtas pshut of alay morkeves, but the achtas pshut of alay morkeves of chiyuv of atzilas is much lower than the achtas pshut of alay morkeves chas v'shalom of seif of kalama, which we're going to be learning about in the next page.